In section 5.4, we're going to look at more applications and using right triangles and kind of go over a couple things that we do know about right triangles. Whenever you're told to actually solve a right triangle, what they mean when they say to solve a right triangle is you need to find all missing angles and all the missing sides. So that means you should know what angles A, B, and C are equal to, and I know one of them, if it's a right triangle, has to be 90, but you should know all three angles. And you also need to know all three sides, A, B, and C. That's what it means to solve a right triangle. So then we need to know a couple things about actually right triangles. What do we know about right triangles? Well, first of all, we know that all the angles in a right triangle, or any triangle for that matter, must add up to 180 degrees, which means if we can figure out what two of the angles are, we can absolutely find the third. And if it's a right triangle, we automatically know that one of them is 90 degrees. We also know, because we have a right triangle, that we can use a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but only because it's a right triangle. And this is what's called the, as a reminder, Pythagorean theorem. But as a reminder, it only works in these cases because we have right triangles, and I'm making this very clear because later on we will look at triangles that are not right triangles, so we need to be careful that we really do know that this is only for right triangles. Also, when you have a right triangle, you can use your 6 trigonometric functions, your SOHCAHTOA. And so we've got our SOHCAHTOA. And just besides sine, cosine, and tangent, whenever you have those three, you also have the reciprocal. So you have 6 trigonometric functions you can use when you have your right triangle. And also when you have your 6 trig functions, you also have the inverses or the opposites of those 6 trig functions. So we do have inverse sine, inverse cosine, inverse tangent, inverse cosecant, inverse secant, and inverse cotangent. As a reminder, only sine, cosine, and tangent are on your calculator, and for the inverses, only inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent are all on your calculator. And that doesn't really matter which calculator you got, they only do those 3 main. So what are those inverse trig functions going to do? Well, remember that trig functions relate sides and angles. So if you use the inverse trig function, this is going to help you find angles. So let's go over a quick example of this so that then we can use it in action. So the idea here is if I have sine of A equals 0.85, how would we solve this? Well, the way that I look at this is, let me do a quick little side example first, is what if I have the square root of x equals 2? Well, you'd say to get rid of the square root, you do the opposite and you'd square both sides of the equation. The square root and squared get rid of one another, leaving you with just the x. And then on the other side, you had to square the other side, so 2 squared is 4. So our answer would be that x equals 4. We want to do something very similar here, but with the trig functions. So the question becomes, what is the opposite of sine? What's going to get rid of sine? And that is its inverse. So what we do is kind of the same idea. We put the inverse sign out in front of the sign, and that it's a function, so it gets applied to it. But then if you do it to one side, you have to apply the inverse sign to whatever on the other side. So what then happens is the inverse sign and sine cancel out because they're inverses, and we'll just leave you with what's inside the A. And on the other side, we did have to take the inverse sign of the 0.85. So this is where you'd begin to use your calculator and take the inverse sine of 0.85. Now be careful, we want to make sure that we are in degree mode or radian mode depending on what kind of angle they want. Let's assume they want our angle in degrees. And depending on how my math lab tells us to round, what we've got here is a 58.2 degree angle. If you do want to see more on how to use your calculator when the trig functions, please see the calculator add-on that we created that video for section 5.3, and that should help out quite a bit. Continue